people would say, oh, it would make Ohio State fans feel better to win a national title in the year that they
just go win a national title.
Right.
Yeah, so easy, right?
Okay, so let's beat Tennessee, and then you got Oregon after that, and then potentially you got Texas, and then maybe you got Georgia or Notre Dame, who's played some pretty good ball to win a national title. I don't know about that one.
I mean, but that is something that really stands out because we have been having that conversation about how does Ryan Day make up for that loss to Michigan. You do have to go through some really, really good teams to do it. And this is what I think we wanted with the 12-team playoff. You wanted a lot of this to be decided on the field. You didn't want the committee just saying, hey, we think you're better than Indiana, so this is going to be the order we rank the teams. This determines the bowl games. Oh, and Boise State, nice season, but you were nowhere near the 4-team playoff bracket. So I think that part's going to be really cool. I mean, the first round games really enticing. The quarterfinals, we've also seen some really intriguing matchups. You do have the potential rematch for Ohio State, Oregon, but otherwise, we're going to see a lot of new matchups. We're getting like a State of Indiana clash with the Hoosiers and the Fighting Irish. There's a lot that jumps out here. And I want to talk about just the overall message that the committee is sending by giving us this bracket, making the decisions that they did with SMU over Alabama, and also all of the things that we're talking about, the ordering of teams, the top 4 seeds getting buys. What are we learning? What does this committee want us to take away from this?
Okay, so I think it's really twofold. Number one, we talked about it a little bit. Winning your conference matters, and we're not going to hurt you if you go to the conference championship game and lose it, which I think is important. What they did with SMU there in a tight game, right? The way that they treated Penn State and the way that they treated Texas, they wanted to make that a big deal still, and it should be a big deal. Not a perfect way to do it with the way that the bracket comes together, but this idea of conference championships having to matter is important. The second thing I will say is I think they kind of looked at people who have looked at the committee historically and said, you're a brand biased committee. You value brands more than you value good football teams. Put Indiana in there. There was no question coming into the weekend that Indiana was going to be one of these teams. SMU, again, put them in there, and there was a question. Do you take SMU? Do you take Alabama? And for the teams that want to go out there and lose to Oklahoma and not score a touchdown, for the teams that want to lose to Kentucky at home and then tell us about how great the road environments are in their conference, for those teams, we're not even looking at you. You're not going to get in here. And I think that was a great message to send. Handle your business.
Yeah, usually we don't always get messages about the quality of losses, right? Because you hear about the wins. But I think making the point about the losses that Alabama had is still valuable. And they went out of their way to also point out that it still incentivizes strength of schedule. Because the only reason Alabama was as close as they were was because of the strength of schedule that they had. I agree with you. I think there was a statement made about, Indiana after they only had one big game on their schedule and they fell short. They didn't fall out of the bracket.
Right.
And the committee made a point, you can only play who you can play. And I think that's a really important message in the era of mega conferences because they're going to be imbalanced. Like Indiana's schedule was not the same as Ohio State's schedule. But they're never going to be unless, historically, the trends are the same. And so they schedule them similarly. So you're going to have to weigh that every single year. And I think that's something the committee said was we're just going to try to evaluate based on what you had. What you couldn't control was what your league gave you as your schedule. So we don't want to penalize in Indiana or in SMU too much on who they avoided based on the way the schedule fell.
Yeah, and I mean, looking at Indiana's schedule coming into the year, too, you had the national championship winner from a year ago. You had the team that played in the national championship game against them.
Should have been better.
It's not Indiana's fault that those teams weren't as good this year, right? That's a part of this conversation, too. It felt like it was a more balanced schedule when we looked at it in August, and now we're sitting here saying, well, they handled business up against what they had.
Right. So I think that's one message that I'm taking away from the committee. I think the trying to incentivize the status quo is another one from the committee because they did not want to blow up the system. They did not want to get rid of conference championship games, which they could have. That message would have been sent. If you take Alabama, who didn't play this weekend, and you put them ahead of an SMU team that had 3-point loss to Clemson, no one wants to play those games. No one's going to play those games. You're going to literally be incentivized to rest players and try to lose down the stretch to not play in those games. So I think that's a really important message. I think also if you go for Alabama, you do run into so many issues about brand bias, the way decisions are being made. Are you just kind of deferring to the SEC and the Big Ten to fill out the bracket? I think picking SMU, structuring the bracket the way they did with Boise State, being above 2 Power 5 champions, is the committee saying, we care about all of college football. We are trying to do what is the healthiest and smartest decision for the entire sport.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think that's what they were trying to do, and particularly with Boise State. That goes a long way for the group of five. And we were talking about many teams here. We were talking about Army late in the year and Tulane and some of these other programs. And with all the movement and the TV contracts and everything, I do think it is healthy that the group of five can remain a viable place for players to go and ultimately have a path to compete in the postseason. There's also a question that lingers in my mind. Are we trying to make the sport healthy, or are we trying to crown the best champ every year? And both of the things can be the same in certain scenarios, but it's not always going to be like that. So I'm curious what the committee is going to end up doing in a year where it maybe is a little bit more clear that, like, the SEC is way up, the Big Ten might be way up, and the group of five should just be in by the skin of their teeth on the auto bid, how they handle those brackets.
Yeah, and we'll also see how Greg Sankey, the SEC commissioner, responds to this, right? He had been very much politicking. We had a lot of commissioners going out in the media making their cases, and I think that he will be upset the way that Alabama and Ole Miss and South Carolina were treated down the stretch.
He needs to tell Oklahoma not to bring their A game when they play Alabama.
And Vanderbilt as well, right?
I mean,
these were league games.
Did he tell those teams to read the newspaper before the game, see what the point spread is, and then play like it?
Well, yeah, the hypothetical games don't count. The 22-point spread doesn't matter if you don't win the game. But that is going to be something to track too, because we're wondering if there's going to be tweaks, changes. We'd like to see the seeding piece get changed as well. So those are off-season questions now that we see how this plays out.